It was an ordinary breezy afternoon in the heart of Philadelphia when an event unfolded in the corner cafe that would leave everyone there thinking about how easily we judge one another, and how often we forget to listen. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, blending with the soft clink of cups and the quiet hum of conversations. Inside, people sat with their lattes and pastries immersed in their own worlds, scrolling through their phones, typing on laptops, or chatting with friends. The atmosphere was warm, inviting, and peaceful. At one of the small tables near the window sat Steve Harvey, the well-known television personality, trying to enjoy a rare moment of solitude. He wasn't dressed to stand out, just a plain hoodie and jeans, blending into the crowd as best he could. He had come here for something simple, a break from the whirlwind of public appearances and constant scrutiny that defined much of his life. In this small cafe among strangers, Steve felt like just another face in the crowd, a rare feeling for someone accustomed to being constantly in the public eye. But that feeling of anonymity was abruptly shattered when a sharp voice cut through the comfortable chatter of the cafe, freezing the room in an instant. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" The voice was loud, tinged with anger and impossible to ignore. People around the cafe stopped mid-sentence, turning to find the source. A man stood near Steve's table, his face flushed with fury. He looked to be in his late 40s, his weathered features hinting at a life of hard work and hardship. His clothes, while not in tatters, showed signs of wear, and his stance was confrontational. His body was tense, his fists clenched. For a moment, everyone in the cafe held their breath, unsure of what was about to happen. Steve Harvey, too, was caught off guard. He sat still, not out of fear, but because the situation was completely unexpected. He had come here seeking a peaceful escape, not to be confronted by a stranger. The tension in the room grew, and the man continued his tirade. "You've got everything handed to you on a silver platter," he shouted, his voice trembling with anger. "Do you even know what it's like to struggle?" The patrons of the cafe exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. The barista, who had been preparing drinks behind the counter, paused, her hand hovering near the phone, as though considering whether to call for help. Steve, however, remained calm. He closed the book he had been reading, placing it on the table slowly, and met the man's intense gaze. His voice was steady but quiet as he responded. "Sir," Steve said, his tone measured, "I'm not sure what's upset you, but maybe we could talk about it." The man scoffed loudly, his anger flaring up even more. "Talk? You want to talk? What could you possibly have to say that someone like me would want to hear?" The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone waited, holding their breath. But instead of responding with anger or defensiveness, Steve Harvey did something no one expected. He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but attentive. His calmness seemed to contrast sharply with the man's rage. He gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Please sit," Steve said, his voice gentle but inviting. "Maybe we can talk." For a moment the man hesitated, taken aback by the offer. His anger was still evident, his fists were clenched, his glare unwavering. "Why would I want to sit with someone like you?" he sneered. "You're just another spoiled celebrity who doesn't know what it's like to live in the real world." A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to each other. The barista, still unsure of what to do, kept her hand near the phone, but she didn't make a move. Steve, however, remained unfazed. "Maybe you're right," Steve admitted, his voice calm and thoughtful. "I haven't walked in your shoes. But if you sit down, maybe you can tell me what that's like." For a brief moment the man seemed to falter. His anger hadn't dissipated, but the offer to be heard was enough to make him pause. Instead of sitting down, however, he leaned in closer, his voice low but still laced with hostility. "You think I owe you my story?" he spat. "You think that'll make you feel better about yourself?" Steve's gaze remained steady. "I think everyone has a story that deserves to be heard," he said simply. There was a long silence. The man's anger simmered, but for the first time it seemed to soften, ever so slightly. The patrons around the room continued to watch, their curiosity piqued. They weren't sure what would happen next, but they felt compelled to stay. After what felt like an eternity, the man grabbed the empty chair and dragged it across the floor with a loud screech. He dropped into the seat, his arms crossed defensively, his body tense, but the hostility in his posture had begun to ebb. He glared at Steve Harvey as though searching for something, perhaps a crack in his calm demeanor. His voice was still rough, but there was a new vulnerability in it. "Fine," he muttered, his tone quieter now. "You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you." The tension in the cafe shifted. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer suffocating. The barista relaxed her grip on the phone, and the patrons leaned in, pretending not to eavesdrop but unable to resist the unfolding conversation. Steve Harvey nodded slightly, leaning forward just a bit. "I'm listening," he said simply. And so the man began to speak. What followed wasn't just a story of hardship, it was a revelation. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, the rawness of his emotions breaking through the tough exterior he had so carefully constructed. "You look at me and see someone angry for no reason," the man began, his voice heavy with bitterness. "But you don't know what it's like to lose everything." The room grew even quieter, the faint sound of the espresso machine the only background noise. The man's voice trembled as he continued. "I had a job. A family. A decent life. But then the factory I worked at shut down. Hundreds of us lost our jobs, with nothing but empty promises that they'd relocate us. Promises that never came true." His eyes flitted around the cafe, but he didn't seem to care who was listening. "I tried to hold it together for my wife and kids. Took whatever odd jobs I could find, but when you're scraping by it doesn't take much to break you. My wife, she left. Took the kids with her. Said she couldn't live like that anymore." His voice cracked completely, and the tears that had been hidden behind his anger began to surface. "I can't even blame her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Steve Harvey didn't interrupt. He remained silent, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with empathy as he listened. The man wiped his eyes, taking a deep breath. "Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and know that everyone is looking at you, judging you, thinking you're nothing?" he asked, his voice heavy with emotion. "That's my life now, every single day." The words hit hard, not only for Steve but for everyone in the cafe. A woman at a nearby table shifted uncomfortably in her chair, suddenly engrossed in her coffee, as though trying to escape the rawness of the moment. "And then I see someone like you," the man continued, his voice rising slightly. "Sitting here with your fancy clothes, reading a book like you don't have a care in the world. And it makes me mad. Because no matter what I do, I'll never have what you have." Steve Harvey's gaze never wavered, and he didn't rush to fill the silence. He let the man's words hang in the air, acknowledging the weight of his pain without attempting to diminish it. Finally, Steve leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes," Steve said softly, "but I do know what it's like to feel judged. To feel like people have already decided who you are before you've even said a word." The man looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing in skepticism. "What could you possibly know about that?" Steve's response was not what anyone in the cafe expected. It turned the conversation and the entire mood of the room around in a way that no one could have predicted. "You might think I've got it easy because of who I am," Steve said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "And in some ways you're right. I've never had to worry about a roof over my head or food on the table. But that doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to feel misunderstood." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Everywhere I go, people make assumptions about me. They think they know who I am, what I believe, what I've done, just because of my name. They don't see me as a person, they see a caricature. Someone they can project their own frustrations onto. Kind of like what's happening here." The man flinched, his tough exterior showing signs of cracking. He didn't say anything, but Steve's words had clearly struck a nerve. "I'm not saying my struggles are the same as yours," Steve continued, his tone still calm but now filled with genuine understanding. "They're not. But pain is pain. Feeling like you're invisible or like you'll never be understood, that's something we all face no matter where we come from." The entire cafe was silent now, the kind of silence that felt thick with thought. Even the barista had stopped moving, her tray of cups forgotten. Steve leaned back, giving the man space to absorb what he'd just said. "I'm not here to argue with you," Steve continued softly. "I'm not even here to change your mind. I just want to understand. Because I think we're all carrying things that no one else sees. And maybe Maybe we'd be a little kinder to each other if we did. The man's jaw tightened again, but this time, it seemed like his anger was beginning to dissolve. He exhaled sharply as though releasing something heavy that he had been carrying for far too long. You really believe that? He asked, his voice quieter now, almost unsure. Steve Harvey nodded. I do. And I think maybe deep down you do too. Otherwise, you wouldn't have told me your story. The man blinked, his tough exterior cracking even more. He rubbed the back of his neck and glanced around the cafe, as if seeing it for the first time. A flicker of self-consciousness crossed his face, but when he looked back at Steve Harvey, something had changed. You're not what I expected, he admitted, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. There was a long pause. The tension in the cafe seemed to dissolve, replaced by a quieter, more contemplative atmosphere. Then the man did something that no one could have predicted. He reached across the table and extended his hand to Steve Harvey. The gesture was hesitant, but it was a sign of respect, of understanding. Steve Harvey took his hand without hesitation, his grip firm and sincere. I'm sorry, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. For judging you before I even knew you. Steve smiled, a genuine warm smile that lit up his face. And I'm sorry if I ever gave you a reason to feel that way. The handshake lingered for a moment before the man pulled back, stood up, and smoothed his shirt awkwardly. He glanced around the cafe as though seeing the room and the people in it, in a new light. I think I owe everyone here an apology too, he said, his voice carrying across the room. I came in here angry at the world, mad at people like you who I thought had everything handed to them. But maybe I've been carrying that anger for too long. Maybe it's not about you at all. The patrons in the cafe, who had been watching this unexpected exchange unfold, slowly began to nod in understanding. Then, a few started clapping. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet, heartfelt applause. The man smiled faintly and made his way to the door, pausing just before he left. He turned back to Steve Harvey and said simply, "Thank you," before walking out of the cafe. The door swung closed behind him, and the room seemed to exhale collectively, as if the weight of the moment had finally lifted. Conversations resumed, but there was a new energy in the room. An unspoken connection among the strangers who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Steve Harvey returned to his seat, picked up his book and took a sip of his now cold tea, but before he could fully retreat into his solitude, a woman from a nearby table approached him. "Young man," she said softly, her voice warm. "What you did back there was remarkable. You didn't have to listen to him, but you did. And I think you reminded all of us that sometimes kindness is all it takes to turn things around." Steve nodded, his expression humble. "Thank you. I think we all just want to be heard." The woman smiled and returned to her table, leaving Steve Harvey to his thoughts. Around him, the cafe buzzed with a different kind of energy. Patrons were smiling at each other, striking up conversations and offering small gestures of kindness, holding doors, sharing smiles, picking up tabs for strangers. By the time Steve Harvey left the cafe, the day felt brighter, not just for him but for everyone who had been part of that moment. The man's anger, Steve's empathy, and the simple act of listening had created a ripple effect of understanding and compassion. As Steve walked down the street, he couldn't help but reflect on how small actions could have such a big impact. He hadn't known the man's full story and he probably never would. But in that cafe for a few brief moments they had connected. And that connection had changed the tone of an entire room. Maybe that's all it takes sometimes, Steve thought to himself. Just a little bit of empathy, to remind us that we're not so different after all. This story is not just about Steve Harvey or the man he met that day. It's about all of us, the way we carry our struggles, the way we judge others, and the way we can choose to listen instead of react. If this story moved you, take a moment today to practice a little kindness. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's spread a little more understanding, one story at a time.